All right, we're back at Sensible 2020. I'm your event host, Seth Adler. Thank you so much for being here. It's my privilege and honor to do this. We have a great panel coming up right now. It is Mike Lazewski and his panelists talking about lobbying for change. Mike?
Thanks, Seth. This panel is called Lobbying for Change. It's a lobby training panel, but it's a little bit different than the standard here's the bill, here's how you go to a lobby meeting, here are the talking points, how you connect those, that sort of thing. I want to talk a little bit more in this session about how you move an idea from wanting to create some sort of change and how you ultimately get there legislatively, and specifically how you can help accomplish that through coalition building. With me are two of my favorite fellow activists and lobbyists here in DC from the Drug Policy Alliance. We have Queen Adesui and we have Justin Streckel from Normal. I want to start off the session by both of you telling me a little bit about your backgrounds and how you got into lobbying and saw that as a vehicle for how you could achieve the policy goals that you wanted to achieve. Queen, could you start us off?
Sure. As Mike mentioned, I'm Queen Adesui, and I'm with the Drug Policy Alliance in our DC office working on national affairs. And I got into this work, it started off when I was younger. I was a young person who was self-medicating before I knew that's what I was doing. And I'm both born and raised in the Bronx in New York. And it was my transition to Georgetown University as an undergrad that really sparked where I am today, because I actually was able to get language and an understanding of the normal that I knew was not normal. I was in an environment where people used and sold drugs rampantly without consequence. And I had to really grapple with the fact that that was not the case from the place that I grew up in, and it was not the case for the people I grew up around. And I really started to understand that enforcement makes a difference in terms of someone's life prospect. And I did not agree with that. And I also was an undergrad during the legalization campaign in DC, which was the first campaign to actually center racial justice on both sides. So I ended up studying it for a year at Georgetown and got connected with DPA, who held their conference in DC conveniently during the same time in 2015. And I started connecting all the dots and really realized that this is my life's work. So I didn't come into this work intending to be a lobbyist, and I still don't think that I'm a lobbyist. I'm an advocate that lobbies. So that's kind of my distinction. The work is what brought me to lobbying, but I think that there's a difference between the kind of lobbying and advocacy that I align with.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I started off coming from a community organizing background and didn't really think about specifically wanting to be a lobbyist and walking the halls of Congress for a living, but it was sort of coming to a point where I was bumping my head on the ceiling of what could I do, trying to make the things change that I wanted to do without, starting to walk those halls. Justin, could you share some of your background and how you came into this type of work?
Yeah, thank you guys again for having me. My name is Justin Streckel, and I am the National Political Director for Normal, and in that role, one of my many tasks is to be the federal lobbyist. And when I go around the country and I'm training Normal activists about how to advocate for things at the state level, my little punchline at the beginning of my shtick is, my name is Justin and I am your scumbag lobbyist. It's not that what I'm lobbying for is negative. In fact, I'd like to think it's pretty righteous and rational and moral public policy, but that our systems are designed in such a way that the only people who are heard are the ones who show up. And at the federal level, it's completely unrealistic to expect, average Joe citizen anywhere else around the country to have a regular presence here in Washington, D.C. Prior to coming to Normal, I worked on campaign finance policy and tax policy, trying to tax the rich and take away their ability to be able to purchase power in our democracy. And prior to that, I worked on campaigns for 10 years at every level of government all around the country.
And so turning a little bit more to advocacy building now, our organizations, DPA, Normal, SSDP, have been working together for years now. My former organization, Americans for Safe Access, worked very closely with Drug Policy Alliance and Marijuana Policy Project to get through the initial Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment. And so, our organizations and some others have some longer standing roots. As a representative from an advocacy organization, when do you think it makes more sense to build a formal coalition versus just working aside of organizations that have similar objectives as yours? Justin, could you start us off?
Well, I actually, if anything, I'd want to kick it over to Queen to start, because I think I do know DPA does a bit more of a focus on coalition efforts. So I'd much rather have Queen start.
I mean, I would say it's best practice, at least in my experience, to do your best to kind of always work in coalition. It's helpful for current advocacy efforts, and it's definitely helpful for building a succinct movement. And for DPA in particular, because our focus is broad, we're working to end the whole war on drugs, and the war on drugs is so intersectional. It impacts people across all areas. So it's really easy for, an organization like DPA that's framed in that way to really build bridges across people. So for example, immigration is severely impacted by the war on drugs. And there's a whole community of advocates who are working to protect non-citizens in this country who may not necessarily focus primarily on drugs because the harms that non-citizens face is beyond just drug use and arrests and convictions, but it still impacts non-citizens. And the same for us, the war on drugs impacts non-citizens, but we're not necessarily immigration experts. So it's always important to, no matter what issue you're working on, to really get a good understanding of the comprehensive reform that's needed in that effort, and bridge gaps, because when things happen that are sitting at an intersection of different issues, you don't want to wait for the rapid response moment to start talking to organizations that work on different issues. It's important to build relationships before you really need a rapid response moment. So there's a relationship there. There's an understanding of the ways our work coincides, the ways that we can collaborate naturally, and in particular moments of, the need for expedient reform. So the war on drugs is a great example of an issue area that's so large and intersectional that we can bring to the table reproductive justice rights folks. We can bring to the table folks who are fighting for economic justice, folks who are fighting for immigration rights, folks who are fighting poverty and homelessness. It all is intersectional because across all issue areas, most people who are disproportionately harmed in most issues are the same kind of group of people who are sitting at the margins, especially intersectional margins. So I think it's really important to work in coalition to be effective, and to make sure that movements are not stepping on each other's toes either. We don't want to be saying or doing something that might compromise the work of allies in a different space. So being in constant communication, building relationships, makes it so that we're all working together. Even if we're working on particular pieces of our different issues, we're working together in a way that benefits the folks that we're fighting for, broadly, I would say.
I think, Queen, do you think that there's a time where it makes sense for groups working together in the style you're describing to formalize that working group, such as the Marijuana Justice Coalition groups, were sort of a loose network initially, and then decided to formalize? Do you, for younger advocates, SSD peers who are watching, do you have some advice as to when to formalize those types of relationships?
Based on my experience, I think it's better to, if you're saying formally create a coalition, I don't think coalitions need to be formally, it doesn't have to be a formal coalition, but it has to at least exist. There has to be concerted effort to work in coalition. I think there's a lot of strategic reasons to build an actual formal coalition that has brand recognition, that's broad, and everyone knows who's in the coalition, and folks who wait behind their organizations or their individual selves can be clear when we're moving something in particular. But even on the backside, behind the scenes, folks should be working in coalition, whether it's formal or not.
Queen just talked about a bunch of the advantages of working together in a coalition. Some of the others, sheer strength of numbers. Justin, can you talk about some of the advantages, maybe like in more specific instances, how a coalition can be helpful? For example, opening up doors to offices that your organization, or if it's several groups within an issue that are starting to work with groups that are working on other issues, for example, immigration or social work, bringing those types of groups into the fold. Can you talk about how those advantages can help?
Yeah, no, certainly. And when I think of the term coalition, I often think of the more formalized, public facing, like, here are the logos for the groups that are a part of this banner, of which we are singing in harmony, that according to this one mission statement that everyone has agreed to. And I think that Queen very rightly stressed the need for informal coalition. For me, I would just call them relationships, alliances, allyships, comrades, however you want to call it. And I think that this is something that when we talk about building power and when we talk about changing public policy, it's important to remember that there is the status quo of where we are right now. And our goal is not to go from A to B. Our goal is truly to go from A to double Z. And there are a lot of steps along the way. And that's why it's absolutely critical that you have alliances and at least, relationships that can be leveraged at critical points. And that there's a level of trust there. I've had to be very critical of some of my some of my allies in the past for different fights that we've had, where we might be taking different positions on a bill, or we might have a different strategy as far as sequencing of things, or different thought on what is politically possible writ large. And this is something that normal chapters around the country deal with all of the time. But no, you absolutely need to do everything that you can to build those relationships, build those trusts, so that way, even at points when you guys aren't on the same page exactly, you're still you're still reading from the same book, and you're still trying to get to the same conclusion. I have to say, just personally, as someone who organized with Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and 2012, it was the weirdest thing in the world for me to be working with the American Banking Association, trying to advance the cannabis banking bill, which we view and jokingly refer to, but I don't say this publicly, but I'll tell you guys, as the gateway legislation, right? And it's a bill. I can go to a conservative Republican who hates the idea of marijuana legalization because they just accepted the reefer madness rhetoric when they were growing up, and they've never challenged that mentally. But because they listen to the American Banking Association, they'll be like, hey, wait a second, you know what, maybe, and maybe I should take this seriously, maybe I should consider it. And we got nearly 50% of the Republican caucus to vote in favor of that banking bill, which makes it more likely that they're going to vote for the larger reforms that we're looking for, as Queen mentioned, the Marijuana Justice Coalition, of which we are a proud member too. So it's really about just, doing what you can to identify, an old organizing term I know is aces in their places, and trying to figure out when it is time to strategically deploy what assets you have to what specific targets, and try to, as an organizer, for those of you who are listening, like, you often want to think about yourself sometimes as a conductor, right? And sometimes you need the strings, and sometimes you need the horns, and sometimes you need the drums just to not be beating the drums. You talk to the drummer and say, hey, listen, I need you to stop drumming for just a little bit, and try to think of it in a very holistic fashion.
I'm glad you brought up the banking issue, because it is one example where the Marijuana Justice Coalition had a split opinion on where to go with it, and these things inevitably come up when you're working with different organizations, even if your organizations are really like-minded in almost every instance. It's almost inevitable that you're going to have bumps in the road like this. Queen, do you have any thoughts for younger advocates who are working on this, who are working on issues, and they may see some sort of conflict with a coalition partner as a hurdle that you can't get past? Do you have any sorts of thoughts on maybe how to initiate relationships so you don't get into that type of position, and when you get into a conflict, how to work through it?
I would say first and foremost, when building a coalition, before, especially a formal coalition, before actual substantive work gets done, principles for the coalition should be established. So everyone a part of the coalition is at the understanding of, this is our red lines, this is our mandate for this coalition, this is why we are here together, and this is what we're working towards. So there's a clear line of accountability for organizations, like, we won't be pushing this, or this is what our goals are. We can't support something that doesn't do this, or X, Y, and Z. So I would say a statement of principles, any kind of document that, was born of an intentional conversation amongst coalition members or potential coalition members. So there's a understanding and synergy for folks. And I think that also helps build trust on the forefront before a situation comes about where there might be some tension. And then also the one advice I would give is to always move in good faith, and not move in a way where folks may think you're a bad actor, because mistrust in a coalition is the last thing you want. It gets super stressful if you feel like you can't trust your comrades. So I think there's also one other tip is also to make space for differences in approach and strategy, as long as that doesn't conflict with your principles. I would say your principles should be stuck, you should stick to your principles for sure. But if a difference in opinion isn't going to, drastically impact the goals and mandates and the principles of a coalition, it's important to move in good faith on both sides, and just try to minimize mistrust, and always stay honest.
Yeah, I think that those are all really great points. Trying to have a relationship that you can trust your partners, your coalition partners are working in good faith, even if they've made some analysis and calculations that don't align with where your organization wants to go. And if you have that sort of good faith trust that you can assume the best of intentions, it can also allow you to take a step back sometimes and see what's possible from that stance your organization isn't taking, but the coalition partners are taking an opposite stance. Specifically with the banking vote, we were able to see that by the Marijuana Justice Coalition groups that were opposing the vote, they were really making it difficult for House leadership to not do anything in support of the MORE Act. And that opposition to the banking vote generated the markup hearing for the MORE Act ultimately. And ultimately both things were able to move through. It doesn't always work out in that sort of everyone wins type of thing, but it is possible. And both, the two factions within the coalition were able to come back together rather quickly and start working together in concert with one another because the relationships were strong to begin with. And we could tell even when we weren't sharing the same exact strategy, that the vision was still towards that same goal, and that the actions could help build towards that. I want to take this conversation a little bit differently right now. I know a lot of SSDPers are working at the state and local level because that's, for one thing, it's a lot more accessible when you're an advocate first getting into things. And to be honest, that's where most of the laws that impact your day-to-day life are going to take place. But a lot of times when you're first getting into advocacy, you may feel like you're out there going it alone, or there may be very few other partners out there. Justin, how would you help identify possible coalition partners at the local level when you think you may be going it alone?
First off, look up to see if we have a normal chapter there, obviously.
But for other issues as well, just sort of generally speaking.
No, my introduction to cannabis policy was actually as a legislative aide in the Virginia State Senate, and Normal came to my office and requested that my boss be the first senator to introduce a bill to decriminalize, and that we work with Normal to write the bill, and we did, and that's how I got a good working relationship, and yada yada yada. Now I'm their federal lobbyist. It's you want to find allies, and you want to find, not just your typical allies, like your typical allies, you should know, or like any amount of power mapping, you'll find who are your natural allies. But I think it's incredibly important for people to think critically about who are potential unlikely allies and who are going to be vehicles and messengers for the changes that you want to get implemented, with lawmakers who are not going to necessarily give you an open ear, should they even give you the opportunity to meet with them and talk with them in the first place. I will say, as a veteran of state government and now a federal lobbyist, a small group of people's ability to impact change is exponentially higher in a state level than a medium or large size group of people's ability to make change at the federal level. And just one quick example, if you'll permit me, in the Virginia state government, when I was working there then, there was this bill, there was a story about, there was a zoo that had monkeys, and the monkeys were being treated poorly. And there was this big push to be like, oh, we can't have unlicensed zoos. We can't have these unlicensed zoos. We have to think about the monkeys. And a group of maybe like 25 people from around the Commonwealth came together and really, really pushed and really, really ground the pavement on this. And the state government advanced a bill, which it wasn't noticed until it was about to get its final vote, that would actually prohibit mammals in Virginia to be harbored without a specific license. And we as humans are in fact mammals. So lawmakers were so quick to respond to this core group of 25 people just tenaciously at the state capitol and working the phones that they almost banned the legality of having children in Virginia. I only say that just to like highlight the absurdity of how responsive lawmakers can be if you're really, really tenacious and you really put in the pavement at your state capitol.
Queen, do you have any thoughts on where to get started if you're a young activist and your thoughts are just you see a problem out there but you're not exactly sure how to get started working to change policies?
Just to add on to what Justin also said, I would say start with your community too, because it's not just also building, bridging gaps between adversaries or folks who are unlikely to really support your issue. Is also building out your base with people who you're already in relationship and community with, because you might assume that everyone in your community is thinking the exact same way, but I think we also need to remember that we need to foster and politically educate and really push people across when it comes to our communities. And I think a really great example of that actually was DC's legalization campaign, where there was concerted and intentional effort to educate folks about the racial disparities that were happening in DC. So people who, let's say, generational reasons why people are uncomfortable or still needing to learn and destigmatize their thoughts around marijuana and drugs and things of that sort. people were able to come to the table once they were talked to about the criminalization impacts and other pieces of the issue that's not just about free the weed. And I think we just need to think and imaginatively, like creatively, how to talk about the issue differently so we can capture different kinds of people. Because not everyone's going to come to the table for your issue for the exact reason that you come to the table, but they can still come to the table for their reason. So as an advocate, it's important for you to be educated on the different things that pull different kinds of people to your issue and speak to them in that way, or have someone who they would listen to speak to them about the connection they have to that issue. So even if, you know, some older folks in your community are still very nervous about the weed and are still very uncomfortable by it, there's other parts of this issue that will speak directly to them. And eventually, I think it is also still important to destigmatize and get folks to where you are and where, you know, the right side of history is. But for the purposes of moving legislation, for the purposes of advocacy, it definitely starts with those conversations that are comfortable with folks. The reason, like the ways that you can pull people to your table that speak someone's language, I would say.
All right. And we got time for, I think, one more quick wrap-up question. And this is going to deal more with the times we now find ourselves in. Now that COVID-19 has hit, it's changed everything. We can't go up to Capitol Hill like we normally would and go into offices. Are there things out there right now that SSDPers could be doing to work on policy change? And, you know, are there perhaps tactics that could be learned now that could help, even when things resume to more traditional lobbying, that may be helpful down the line in terms of online organizing? Either one of you want to kick it off?
Great, I'll take it. All right. So I think during this time of crisis, I mean, we're not going to go back to normal very quickly, right? Like there is going to be fear for a while. There's going to be a lag in our ability, if and when a vaccine is developed, for it to be mass distributed. So this is a new reality that we need to navigate, period, full stop. You know, it's not like August and everything's going to be fine, or at least I don't imagine it will be. So I think now, like in the immediate short term, do everything that you can to make the public health COVID-oriented, like acknowledge anything that you can do. Right now, policymakers are starved for options and solutions to help mitigate the spread and to help protect to protect the workforce, protect the economy. So anything and everything that you can do to reasonably, rationally, and credibly claim that policy reforms will help, again, mitigate the spread and protect the jobs and economy and economic well-being of their communities, they're going to be receptive to that. So we've been pushing really, really hard for telemedicine appointments for medical cannabis patients, the waiving of the fees associated with those recommendations, the waiving of the requirement for reauthorizations, because some states had really punitive requirements as far as making people do it like every 90 days. Being a thought, like, so to relieve pressure on the healthcare system, we should waive those reauthorization requirements. Delivery and curbside pickup at dispensaries. One talking point we at Normal have used for decades is we need to get marijuana off the streets and put it behind counters. Now we're putting the weedmen back on the street, right? Like we're having them run out to cars and toss it into windows. So it's amazing how this crisis has really completely thrown out the old rule book. And now, it might actually give us a real opportunity to talk about real evidence-based policies that were just completely politically off the table just 3 months ago. So think creatively about how you can, and then again, I cannot stress this enough, credibly and through an evidence-based approach, make a policy recommendation, because we are in a time when there's a lot of fear, but if you can present simple solutions to mitigate spread or protect the local economic well-being of the community, that's going to be something that will resonate if you make that known.
Just to add to that, I would say, really considering how, it's unclear when we're going to get back to normal. But also, like, as advocates, I'm hopeful that there is no return to that normal and that we're figuring out what the new normal is. Because even broader, when we're talking about the decarceration efforts that have been going on, throughout the US since this pandemic has really been hitting, we have policymakers who are now saying, these offenses they're not impacting public safety. We should just release folks.
Yeah.
When we get over this pandemic, it's going to be hard to go back and say, well, how is it that we're still arresting people for these same crimes if just now they were okay to come home and be with their families in the community and be safe there? So I think there's a huge, like, unprecedented opportunity to really jump across to where, we weren't sure we would even see this moment in our lifetime, even saying that as a young person, where we'd really be able to fully, like, decarcerate and stop criminalizing people for large categories of issues. But the pandemic has really made for an environment where it's crucial to do it. It's a matter of life or death, really, to do it. It's not politics. It's hard to keep politics in the way when, such a catastrophe is happening. And even your starchest, like, hard on crime person, like, if you talk to them about the fact that people were not sent to jail to be handed a death sentence for weed, I think it's going to resonate differently when folks are unfortunately, like, going to be dying and dropping like flies in our US prisons and jails and detention centers. So my hope is that whatever the new normal is a huge jump over to more serious conversations about really rolling back mass criminalization and seriously decarcerating and reducing our incarceration population. It was a public health issue before the pandemic, and I think what we're seeing is this pandemic stacking on top of all the other pandemics that we've been trying to fight, for decades. And it's opening up an opportunity for serious, hopefully lasting change.
If I could add one more thing to jump off what Queen just said about, even, we're in a different place where you can even access the most tough on crime political leaders, one of whom is currently now the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party to be president. And I started working on Democratic campaigns because those were the only candidates who were trying to undo policies that said presumptive nominee championed throughout the 80s and 90s and the crime bill. So I think now, particularly for SSDP leaders and young people in general, there is going to be a big effort to court your vote and to court the younger generation's vote. And I think that as you think about how you're going to engage politically, and depending on your I don't know where SSDP stands for local chapters officially making endorsements or anything, but I think tell people what it would take to earn your vote, and I think that it's now is a great time because they're going to be listening. Lawmakers, including the nominee, will be looking to find ways to do so. So make it known.
Can I add one more thing?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Queen, please.
Sorry, I'm actually really, like, genuinely excited, minus the real deep sadness I feel for the extent of harm that we're gonna see from this pandemic. But one thing to be excited for on the advocacy piece really is the moment where we can finally ask for what we really wanted and, like, really didn't have to, or at least there are more limited ways that we can ask for something large without having to play politics and, pit violent versus nonviolent offenders. And we're at a moment where there are a lot of elderly and medically vulnerable people who will die in prisons and jails, who should be with their families and communities. And this is a really important opportunity where we can start pushing even advocates to stop the dichotomy of nonviolent versus violent. This is not a moment for that. Of course, there's concerns around public safety, which are valid, But I think this is a great opportunity that we have to actually really challenge what someone's opportunity to really be a not safe for the society. Sorry, I completely can't get that out. I think this is a real opportunity to really challenge dichotomies that have been challenging even for advocates, in terms of like the extent that we're able to really advocate for all people, and really give us the opportunity to really challenge even how we're categorizing groups of people who are more like victims that are more palatable to even people on the opposition side. This is a real opportunity to really show that criminalization oftentimes is arbitrary. There are offenses that are labeled violent when they actually were not violent in the traditional ways that we think of violence, and that our communities can keep ourselves safe. We really need to think of how we can keep people in community.
Yeah, I think that the sort of hidden opportunity within COVID, it sounds a bit ghoulish to think of in those terms, but that we can the world we've always sort of imagined may be possible, and even the feckless centrist types, Biden himself has said, this is an opportunity for some big changes, and so if centrists are even considering that, activists, really working on the vanguard, really should be seizing upon that when we're all healthy and able to. I think now would be a great time to be able to turn it over to some questions.